In our previous modules, we've configured a MetaHuman to utilize a facial performance live streamed from Faceware Studio. If we'd like to use this facial performance in something such as a video game or virtual production, we'll need to record the facial animation to an animation sequence asset. In this module, we'll show how to configure and use Unreal Engine's Take Recorder to capture the facial performance and save it as an animation sequence asset. Before we begin using the Take Recorder, we should configure a few settings so that our performance will be captured appropriately. We'll start with project settings. To access them, we can go to the Edit menu and choose Project Settings. Here, we'll want to configure the frame rate of the project to match the frame rate of the source video that's being streamed from Faceware Studio. We can find the frame rate in the General Settings for the engine. Looking here in the left-hand panel, past the engine, we'll find General Settings. Clicking this section, we can scroll down to the bottom of the panel and find frame rate. We'll want to use a fixed frame rate and set that frame rate to 60, as this matches the frame rate of the video that's generating the streamed facial performance. Optionally, there are also settings for the Take Recorder here in the Project Settings. They can be found further down in the left-hand panel. Under the Plugins section, we'll find an option for Take Recorder. Properties that can be adjusted here include the directories that animation recordings will be saved in, the default slate name, as well as a number of other parameters used by the Take Recorder. For our purposes, we can leave all of these set to their defaults. So let's close Project Settings. At this point, we can go ahead and open the Take Recorder. To do so, we'll find it under Window, Cinematics, and Take Recorder. This opens two new panels for us, the Take Recorder itself, as well as Sequencer. Sequencer is used to facilitate the recordings that Take Recorder will generate. By default, it's usually a floating window, but I like to keep it next to my content browser. So I'm going to drag this tab right next to the content browser and release here. This keeps it a little bit out of the way and lets me see the viewport. Our Take Recorder and Sequencer are both defaulted to 24 frames per second. We'll need to set this to 60 frames to match our project. So clicking the drop-down here in Take Recorder, selecting 60 frames per second. And now we've updated both the Take Recorder as well as the Sequencer. Before we can begin recording, we'll need to add our MetaHuman actor from the scene as a source here in Take Recorder. Our MetaHuman is selected here in the level, so we can use the green Add Source button here in Take Recorder to add our actor. Simply click the green button, choose From Actor, and because our MetaHuman is selected, she's right here at the top of the list. We'll select her and see that she's available as a source, and now our Take Recorder Record button is enabled. Before we start recording, let's configure our MetaHuman so that only facial performance data is recorded. We'll select our MetaHuman in the Sources list, expand the Details panel below, and deactivate all traits for recording. Then we'll locate the Face component here by expanding under Root, and then expanding under Body. Here's the Face component for our MetaHuman. We'll activate this, and now only the face will be recorded. There's one final adjustment we might want to make before starting recording. By default, when the Take Recorder Record button is pressed, a countdown timer is initiated before recording begins. This is useful on set to prepare the crew and performers for when recording is about to start. But for our purposes, it might be more useful to have the Record button begin recording immediately, so we can just press it when we see that our performance loop is about to begin. Let's adjust that setting. It's located under the Edit menu and Editor Preferences. Here, we can scroll down in the left-hand panel and locate Take Recorder. Here we'll find the countdown parameter. It's set to 3 seconds by default, but we're not going to need this. So let's go ahead and set this to 0. With that done, we're ready to go for our recording. So with Take Recorder ready to record, we'll wait till we get to the end of the line, hit record. I think I missed the beginning of this recording, so we're going to let her cycle through all the way to the end of the line a second time. So here begins our loop that we like. When she gets to the end, I can hit the stop button to end the take. All right, so we've got our take. I'll hit stop. All the data will get finalized and saved into our content areas. This message is not really going to impact the data that we're being recorded, so we can just hit no to this. And at this point, Take Recorder has saved the animation data. We're ready to do another take, and if we were working with an actor with live data, we could start recording additional lines. So let's take a look at where that data ended up. I'll just go ahead and exit from our simulation mode by accessing our stop button here. Could have also used the escape key to do that. And we'll go into our content browser and we'll find that there's a new folder that's been created called Cinematics. And this is where we were set up for all of our take recordings to be written into. Inside that, we'll find a folder for takes. Double-clicking, that'll give us a folder for today's date. And then inside that, there's a scene and a set of sub-scenes. We're not going to need the sequences. We're really only interested in the animation sequence data itself. So we'll continue to drill down into the next folder. And finally, we reach a folder that's labeled animation. We'll go in there and find our animation asset. Hovering over this, we see that we have the full name of our actor and that this is an animation sequence. Double-clicking will open our animation sequence editor. And here we can see our animation data curves and an example of that performance. And in our upcoming modules, we'll take a look at how we can start to utilize and edit the data that's been recorded. In our last module, we successfully recorded an animation sequence asset for our MetaHuman face performance. In this module, we'll begin the process of looking at how we can edit and use these assets in our Unreal Engine level. Before we get too far into that, let's do a little housekeeping first. I'm going to close the animation sequence editor and also close the take recorder, as we won't need that any further. Next, I'll return to the content browser. And here is our animation sequence asset as recorded by Take Recorder. I'd like to preserve the original recording and always work on a copy so that if I ever need to return to the original recording, that file is always available. So I'll open our source panel for the project and create an animations folder specific to our MetaHuman. So I'll expand the MetaHumans entry and then expand the entry for Danielle, which is this MetaHuman. Here, I'll right-click and create a new folder for animations. So right-click, new folder, and entering in the word animations. Now that we have a folder to store our Danielle animations, we can go back to the Take Recorder animation folder, and then click and drag this asset over to the new folder. When I release, I have this pop-up menu where it gives me the option to move, copy, or advance copy. A simple copy here is all we need. This will copy the asset file over, preserving the original, so that we can always go back to it if necessary. Finally, I can click on our new animations folder for Danielle, and we see that this copied asset has a star in its tile. This indicates that it hasn't been saved as a file yet, so let's take care of that by right-clicking and choosing Save from the pop-up menu. Once this is fully saved, we can go ahead and close our source panel here by clicking this button. And now we're ready to begin editing. In this module, we'll mainly look at the animation sequence editor. To open that, we just double-click our animation sequence asset and return to the animation sequence editor. Let's maximize this window, maybe expand the viewport, and use our standard viewport controls to move in close to our face so that we can take a good look at the performance on our MetaHuman face model. Now, one of the things that we'll notice about our animation sequence is that there are 1,000 curves recorded here. This is every possible value that could be recorded about the MetaHuman face. Most of these values are actually being procedurally driven by the primary control curves. So if I were to scroll down further, we'll note that some of these curves contain WM. This represents wrinkle maps, These wrinkle maps are actually driven by the primary controls, and any time our character scrunches her face, we activate the wrinkle maps to simulate the look of wrinkles as well as the shadows using the color map. Another set of procedural curves are the LOD curves. These represent level of detail, and again, they're procedurally driven by the primary curves. So we can dramatically improve the efficiency of this asset by deleting all the unnecessary curves. Let's start with the LOD curves. I'll go to my filter entry here and type in the letters LOD. Now, only curves that contain LOD are being displayed. If I select one and then use Ctrl A, I've now selected all of the LOD curves, and I can right-click and choose Remove Selected to delete them. This brings us down to just over 300 curves. Now let's get rid of those wrinkle map curves as well. I'll go back to my filter, type in WM for wrinkle map, and again select a curve and use Ctrl A to select them all. Finally, right-click, Remove Selected, and now we're down to a nice manageable 262 curves. Let's clear out our filter, and finally, Apply, and Save. So now we have an asset that has only the 262 primary curves in them. Now let's take a look at how we can edit those curves individually. I'll hit pause here on our playback and take a look at the eyes. Here, the eyes dart off to the left. Let's see if we can adjust the degree to which these eyes are moving to the left. First, we'll find the curves related to the eye direction. So in our filter, we'll enter in EYE for eye. Scrolling down here, we can find that there are some curves called look up, look down, look left, and look right. Here our character is looking to the right of the screen, but since she's facing us, that's actually a look to our character's left. So we're interested in editing this look left for the left eye and look left for the right eye. Let's select these two curves and right-click and choose Edit Selected Curves. This will open our curve editor, and rather than load all the data from those 200 plus original curves, we're only loading in the data for the two selected curves, making the editor much more efficient. So here we are in the timeline, and here is the peak of the data as our left and our right eyes look off to the left. Let's take a closer look at this by using our left mouse button, click and drag to select these keys, and then tap the F button to frame or fill our view with the selected keys. So there are a number of ways that we could edit this set of keys. I'll start by selecting just the keys that are involved in looking to the left. Before and after this moment, the eyes are roughly in the center. Now I can use the Transform tool to freeform transform these keys. Clicking on this control here activates the Transform tool. One of the things that we probably want to deactivate here is snapping. We wouldn't want to adjust any of the fractional values for our time positions, nor do we want to be limited in snapping our vertical values for these keyframes. So let's deactivate both vertical and horizontal snapping here. Now, as a safety measure, we wouldn't want to move the time location of any of these keys. So our move control currently is set to allow movement in both axes. Let's click this dropdown and choose Y only. Now, if I were to click and drag on the Transform tool, I'll only be able to move these keyframes vertically in terms of their values, but their time position will be maintained. Any transformation with this tool is going to be relative to the pivot point. So I could drag a corner or a side, or I could drag the entire control area. So if I wanted to lower these values just a little bit, I could click and drag and slide downward. I could also click one edge and slide to the center, or I could click a different edge and slide away. All of these adjustments are being made relative to this pivot point. So if I were to move where this pivot point is, then I would move the direction that my scaling is taking place in. So for example, with the pivot in the center, if I click on this top edge and move upward, you'll notice that the bottom of the transform is moving downward, away from the pivot. If instead I wanted all of these keys to move relative to the lowest key value, I can click and drag the pivot point, bring it down to the bottom of my transform area, and then click and drag this top edge, and you'll see that the keyframes all scale relative to this pivot point. These changes I don't want to keep, so I'll go ahead to Edit and Undo Transform. This brings us back to our original curves. There is another way of maintaining our original data. Let's deselect all of our keys, and with just these two curves selected, I can right-click an empty space here and choose Store Curves. By doing that, these two curves in their current state have been stored in memory. So if I select a number of keys and move them around, and do it again, you see this ghost of the captured curves that I recorded by using my right click. Let's make sure we deselect all our keys. By using that Store Curves. Now I'm not going to click that again, but if I want to restore those original curves, I can choose Apply to Stored Curves. And now my original data is returned. One other adjustment that I might want to make here is to adjust all of these values relative to their present values. So rather than selecting and using the transform tool relative to just the values that have been selected, I might want to adjust these values relative to where they are currently. There's a really nice way of doing that. I'll select my arrow button, select just the keyframes involved in this look, and then here, for the Y value of multiple values, I'll enter in star equals 0.5. What I'm doing here is entering in a value that I will multiply all the keyframes by. So I'm multiplying, and the value I'm multiplying by is equal to 0.5. And this will lower all of the values by half of their current value. Simply hit Enter to apply, and now we can see that curve is adjusted. If I wanted to restore this, having known that I just multiplied by 0.5, I could just as easily multiply by 2 to get back. So again, with multiple values selected, I can type in star equals 2. This will now multiply the current values by 2, hit Enter to apply, and we've got our original values back. Besides editing key values directly, it's also useful to be able to filter values to smooth the data that we already have. Let's use a different curve as an example of this. We'll close the curve editor. Let's focus on the movement of the eyelids. To do that, we'll find the curves that drive blink. So we'll replace eye in our filter with the word blink. Here we find two curves, blink left and blink right. We'll select both of these, right-click, and choose Edit Selected Curves. Here we see all the keyframe data related to the two blink curves. Let's take a look at this area. It looks a bit noisy. We'll drag select these keyframes and tap F to frame them up. And here it is, this area right here, where we seem to have a lot of up and down motion. If we hit play in this area, we can see a little bit of flutter in those eyelids. It's a little distracting. Let's filter that out. So again, I'll select just the keyframes that I'm interested in filtering out right here. Now let's open our filtering options. We do this with this last button here in the toolbar. Clicking this opens up our Curve Editor Filters panel. Let's move this out of the way and select Fourier Transform. FFT stands for Fast Fourier Transform. It's a great filter for smoothing out data. The real nice thing about this is it can isolate low-frequency data from high-frequency data. A low-pass filter type will allow the low frequencies of overall motion to come through, while filtering out the high frequencies that are causing high jitter and noise. I usually use the Butterworth response, so we'll choose that, and a cutoff frequency adjusts at what level the high frequencies begin to be filtered out. At 0.8, these are very high frequencies. I'm going to set this to 0.5 so that a larger bandwidth of frequencies on the high end will get filtered out. Again, our filter is going to be applied to our selected keyframes, So let's keep an eye on those as we hit the Apply button. Now we can see that the vast majority of this data has smoothed out significantly. We can use the Apply button again to continue filtering. We are starting to see a little bit of an artifact here on the very first keyframe. As these get smoothed, there's a little bit of error resulting in these keyframes being increased instead of smoothed out. So let's just delete these first 2 frames here and allow the values between to be interpolated. I'll just hit the delete key with those selected. And there we've smoothed out the data. I can close my filters panel and hit play. We see much less flutter in the eyelids. To finish all of our changes, we'll make sure we click Apply, and of course Save to record all of our changes. With that, we're ready to move on. We'll use our animation sequence in the sequencer in our next module. In previous modules, we recorded and edited an animation sequence of facial performance for our MetaHuman. In this module, let's start the process of using that animation sequence in a level sequence to play back the animation on our MetaHuman. We'll start by creating a level sequence. I'm here in my Animations folder for my MetaHuman, and I'll right-click, go to Animation, and then select Level Sequence to create a level sequence. Let's just name this after the scene. Scene_1, and hit Enter. The asset's created, but it's not saved. Let's use Ctrl+S to save that asset, and then double-click to open in our sequencer. Now that we have a level sequence, let's add our MetaHuman to the sequence so that we can animate her. We'll select the actor from the level, go to the +track button, and select Actor to Sequencer, and then find our actor at the top of the list, since she's already selected. By default, Unreal is going to add the actor with a control rig for the body and a control board for the face. For the purposes of this lesson, we're not going to need the body animation, so let's right-click on that track and choose Delete. Next, in the face track, we have a control board, and we're not going to need that yet because we're going to use an animation sequence. Let's right-click on the control board track and delete that as well. Now we can use the +track button here on the face track to add animation to our MetaHuman. By clicking the +track button and going to Animation, we'll see a list of all animation sequences that are connected to MetaHuman faces. Here we can select the animation sequence that we've been editing. Note that in the pop-up information, we see the path that tells us that this is the animation associated with our Danielle MetaHuman. There's another animation sequence with the same name, but the path indicates that this is the original take that was captured by the take recorder. Let's go to our edited animation sequence and select it. Now the animation sequence is here on the animation track for the face of our MetaHuman in the level sequence, but when we scrub through the timeline, we don't see any animation on our MetaHuman. This is because the animation blueprint that we have selected for the MetaHuman face actor is actually still set to the Faceware Studio animation blueprint that we had created earlier. Let's change that to the default MetaHuman animation blueprint so that animations in the animation sequencer can be shown. We'll select our MetaHuman, choose the face component, and in the animation group, change our animation class from our Faceware animation blueprint, and instead choose FaceAnim BP, which is the default animation blueprint for MetaHuman faces. With that selected, our MetaHuman actor will now perform any animation sequence that we're playing back here in Sequencer. By default, our level sequence only has 150 frames. Jump to the end, we haven't really gotten through the entire animation sequence. So let's correct that by extending our timeline out to at least 800 frames. I'll click this value here to the right of our scroll bar and type 800 and hit Enter. Now we can see more of our frames and see that the animation sequence ends here. We'll scrub out to that ending and see that we're very close to frame 400. Let's jump directly to frame 400 by entering it right here. 400, enter. Now I can use our right bracket to set the end point of our level sequence. And now we can see our entire animation sequence fits here in our sequencer view. Let's grab the right side of this scroll bar and drag to the left to zoom back in. So now we can really focus on the entirety of this animation sequence. Now, let's set up an audio file so we can synchronize our animation to the audio from the original video. If we look in the folder structure for our project, under Content Movies, we'll find an audio file that's called hungrypurpledinosaur.wave. This is the original audio from the video that was tracked in Faceware, provided as a WAV file. However, if we go to our project, into the content browser, we'll reveal our source panel, and go to the Movies folder, we don't have an asset for that audio file. We'll need to import that so that we have an audio asset that we can use in Sequencer. So we'll right-click, choose Import, and select our audio WAV file. Now that that's imported, we have an asset that we can use in our sequencer. Let's make sure that we select and Control S to save that, and then return to Sequencer. Now we can add an audio track by clicking the plus track button here in Sequencer and selecting Audio Track. Finally, clicking the plus audio button here on our audio track allows us to select the newly created audio asset. That asset was dropped into the current frame, which at the moment is frame 400. Let's drag that back in our sequencer to the beginning of our clip. Here we are. Now we can push play and hear our audio. We'll go to the beginning of our clip, frame 0, push play.
The hungry purple dinosaur ate the kind zingy fox, the jabbering crab, and the mad whale and started bending and quacking.
Okay, obviously our animation's not in sync. So let's scrub through the timeline and look for where the beginning of our clip is in our animation sequence. As we scrub through here, we can see that there's a point here where our animation gets ready to start performing. Right here we have our neutral frames at the end of the clip. And scrubbing a little bit further as we look at the face, we'll see her face respond and get ready to begin performing. So right here, we'll right-click on our animation sequence, choose Edit, and Trim Section Left. This will remove all of the animation sequence that takes place before this frame. So Edit, Trim Selection Left, and now we've trimmed the beginning off of our recording, since that was the end of the video being tracked. Now let's slide our animation sequence to the beginning of the performance. In Sequencer, go back to our first frame, and audition this by hitting play.
The hungry purple dinosaur ate the kind zingy fox, the jabbering...
Okay, we're close, but not quite there. Now the audio file shows us the waveform, so we can see that right here is the word the, and then here's the word hungry. Let's click here and just listen.
The hungry purple...
Great. So right here is where our audio announces the word hungry. Let's look for that moment here in our animation sequence where the jaw opens up to say the word hungry. I'm just going to click on our animation sequence and drag to the left. And there we go. Let's take the beginning of this animation and bring it back to the first frame. When we drag the beginning of our animation sequence, only moving the endpoint for that sequence, this frame here is still the same frame where the jaw was open. So let's go to the beginning again and play.
The hungry purple dinosaur ate the kind zingy fox, the jabbering crab, and the mad whale and started bending and quacking.
Great. So we have a much better sync now with our animation with this audio file. So we don't need the end of this. Now I could right-click and choose Edit, Trim Section Right. That would remove the end of this. I could also simply click the very end of this animation sequence and drag towards our ending point. That would work as well. And one other option is I could right-click, choose Edit, and then Split Section. This cuts our animation sequence into two separate sections, and I can select the ending and choose Delete from my keyboard to remove it. Finally, if we look at this, we're not sure if we're exactly in sync. What would really help is if we could see the original frames from the video and make sure that something really identifiable, such as this blink, is in sync with the original video. So let's bring in the frames from the original video so we can use those to compare the synchronization of our animation sequence. Looking back at our folder structure, in our project content movies, there's another folder called HBD. Inside here is an PNG sequence. This is one PNG file for every frame in the original video. We can use this in Unreal Engine within our sequencer to play the video back in Unreal Engine. Let's set this up by beginning in the content browser. We'll set up an image media source in order to bring in that image sequence. To do that, we'll just right-click, go to Media, and then choose Image Media Source. We'll call this HPD_frames. Enter. Let's double-click and choose our sequence path. Just click this ellipsis button. This will bring our file browser open. We'll go into HPD and select the first frame of the sequence. Choose Open. The path is relative, which is great, but we do need to set up our frame rate for this image sequence. So let's extend this area, and for frame rate override, make sure we choose 60 frames a second, which is the original frame rate of the original video. With this set up, we can hit Save and close this window. Going back to our sequencer, we can now add a track to play back that image sequence. To do that, we'll go to the plus track button and then select Media Track. In Media Track, we'll click the plus Media button and choose our HPD frames media source. This drops in our media source at whatever frame our playback head is at. So let's bring this back to the beginning of the sequence and then extend it for the duration of the sequence. Finally, we need to make sure our sequence has the same frame rate as the image sequence. So we'll switch this from 30 frames to 60 frames per second. Let's save our sequence at this point. Now, our animation is able to read in those frames, but we can't see them in our project yet. So let's bring up a plane that we can display while we're working in our sequencer so that we can see the frames from the original video. First, we'll need to make sure that these frames are being put onto a texture that can be used in a material. So we'll right-click our HPD frames here in the sequencer, go to Properties, and then go to our Media Texture section. It's set to None by default. If we click this drop-down, we have the opportunity to create a new asset, a media texture. So we'll select that. We'll put this in our Movies folder, and we'll call this HPD_texture. Let's click Save, and then make sure that this is assigned to our HPD frames by right-clicking, going to Properties, going to Media Texture, and selecting our new media texture from this dropdown. Now, as the sequencer plays, each frame of the video will be put into this texture. We'll save our sequence again, and now let's return to our content browser and click Save All to make sure that all the assets that we've been creating have been saved. Finally, here's our HPD texture that we just created. Let's put that onto a plane in view in our level. We'll go to Place Actors. Under Basic, we'll locate the plane drag that into our scene. Let's lift it up so we can see it a little better. And then we'll drag our HPD texture onto that plane to create a material that'll display it. Next, let's rotate this plane into position so we can easily see it. Tap the E key, rotate up in this case by 90 degrees, and we'll spin it around 180 degrees so we can see it. And then use the W key so that we can move this into place where it's easy to see. The aspect ratio of this is a little bit off. This video has a 16:9 aspect ratio. So for scale, let's use 1.6 for X, and then we'll use 0.9 for the width. So now we have a 16:9 aspect ratio plane displaying our original video in the level as the level sequencer plays. When we dragged our texture onto this plane, it automatically generated a new material, HPD texture material. There's a star on its tile indicating that it's not saved yet. So let's go ahead and click Save All and save all of our unsaved assets. Finally, we can go back to our sequencer and let's set the end of the sequence to match the end of our videos here. Move the playhead to the end and click our right bracket to set the end of our sequence. Finally, let's play this back, see how it looks.
The hungry purple dinosaur ate the kind zingy fox, the jabbering crab, and the mad whale and started bending and quacking.
So sync looks pretty good. Let's just double check on those eyes. Scrolling backwards. Sure enough, the eyes in our animation descend and ascend in sync with our playback video. This puts us in a great position to evaluate our original video against the performance that we're getting from our MetaHuman, so that we can make fine edits to the animation sequence. We'll do some more of that beginning in the next module. In this module, we'll be diving into the editing tools available in the sequencer interface that allow us to edit animation sequences, perform keyframe animations on control rigs, and use the curve editor, as well as ultimately bake all of our edits down to a new animation sequence. So let's start by taking a look at our synchronized clip here. We'll go back to the beginning and hit play to review.
The hungry purple dinosaur ate the kind zingy fox, the jabbering crab, and the mad whale and started bending and quacking.
Okay, so everything's in sync and it's working. But let's just say that our director came in and just announced that the dinosaur that has been cast is allergic to shellfish. So we're good with the fox, we're good with the whale, but we can't have the dinosaur eating a crab. First of all, let's make sure that we know which portions of our audio clip correspond to our dialogue. So if we go here, I think we're talking about the fox.
Kind zingy fox.
All right, so we can go here and tap the M for mark key, and that's applied a mark right here on frame 138. If I move our playhead away from 138, we can see the letter A here. Going back here, I can right click and change the label of this. So let's just call this Fox. And then here we have our crab dialogue. So I'll tap M, right click, and rename that crab. And finally, right here, I'll go ahead and select this, right click, add a mark, right click, and change this to whale. Okay, so we want to get rid of the portion of dialogue that relates to the crab. We're already here at the end of that piece of dialogue, so we can slice or split our segments into two right on this frame. So I'll start by selecting dialogue, right click, choose edit, and split section. Same for our image sequence. And finally, once again, for our animation sequence that's driving the face. In each case, the split section command split the selected animation track at the current frame that the playhead was on. So now I can go to the crab frame and again, repeat for each one of these tracks. Right-click, edit, split section. Note that Control/ is the shortcut for this. So let's go ahead and use that here on our frames. Incidentally, the slash is the key on the US keyboard that's just to the left of the right-hand shift key. And now for the audio, Control/. So now we have a separate segment right here just for the crab. We're not going to need this for our clip anymore. So I'll drag select these and hit delete. This portion of the clip is now removed. Now we can move our whale back over in place of where the crab was. What I'm going to do is use the square controls on the end of my horizontal scroll bar here to zoom into my timeline in this area where we need everything to come together. So I'll just click one of these squares, pull here, and click another square and pull here. So now I can drag my whale clip over so it touches where crab is. And same for our frames. And finally for our facial animation. I'm going to try and keep that all lined up on a single track. Notice that our marks stay put because they're tied to the sequencer timeline, not to the clips themselves. So I can go ahead and right-click on this crab mark and delete this mark. I can click on our whale mark and drag that in to follow where all the other clips are. Okay, so we can audition this. We'll move the playhead back a little bit and listen to the dialogue and watch our video and animation.
Fox and the mad whale and started venting.
All right, so the audio sounds fine. Of course, our video is only being used for reference, so the fact that that jumps between the two clips, that's no problem. However, this is going to be our final performance, and we don't want that to pop from one clip to the next. We need that transition to be smooth. To make this possible, we'll zoom in just a little bit more, and we take the second section, go to the right edge, click, and drag to the left. And now this gives us some overlap, essentially a crossfade. We can do the same with our earlier clip, the left-hand clip, selecting that, grabbing its right edge, and dragging to the right. This gives us a crossfade. Let's take a look at this animation as we play back this time. I'll give it a little more runtime.
Kind zingy fox and the mad whale and started vending and quacking.
So we have a little bit of an issue here where our crossfade is actually stomping over some of the dialogue right here. So let's make sure we bring the end of this transition to before the dialogue for the whale. This transition is being eased in and eased out. We can adjust the rate at which these fade into one another by right-clicking, choosing Options, and choosing from one of the other transition curves. I'm going to use Linear. With that selected, you can see that these transition clips are now linear, and there'll be a smooth linear transition. Let's try our playback once again.
Kind zingy fox and the mad whale and started vending and quacking.
Nice. So this is pretty good. We've probably done enough editing at this point that we should be saving another version of our sequence. So we'll just go over to the tool button here for actions, click on that, and choose Save As. This will let us save a copy of this scene. I'm going to just add a suffix of _TK02 for take 2 of this scene. Go ahead and hit save. And now we have a whole new sequence asset for our edited sequence. I can just double check by going to the content browser and seeing we have the original scene 1 and scene 1 take 2. There's an asterisk here for scene 1, so it still has the edits that we've been working on. Let's make sure we remove those by right-clicking, choosing Asset Actions, and selecting Reload. We'll say yes to this dialog. And now we know that Scene 1 has not been edited, and our Scene 1 Take 2 is the one that we're working on. All right, so let's go back to Sequencer and look at ways that we can have more detailed editing control over our sequence. In particular, we might want to adjust the way the mouth moves for some of the dialogue here. Let's take a look.
Fox and the mad whale and start.
So right there's a little bit of a problem. Right here we have a dialogue that says the mad whale. And when we play that, the lips don't quite ever come together on our metahuman as the character says mad whale. It'd be great to be able to adjust the controls of the face so that we get a good lip contact for the pronunciation of the word mad. We can do this by baking all of the animation that we have now over to the MetaHuman control rig, where we can edit it with keyframes and the curve editor. To do this, we simply go over to the face track here on the left side of our sequencer, right-click, and choose Bake to Control Rig, and then Face Control Board Control Rig. We select this, accept the defaults, and hit Create. Sequencer will copy all of the information that we've edited in the animation sequence and bake it to a set of keyframes on the MetaHuman Face Control Board Control Rig. So let's put this to use. At this point in our dialogue, our performer brings her lips together to say the word mad, but the MetaHuman's lips don't quite touch. So we can use keyframes on the control board track to bring those lips together. Now there's a set of controls called lips towards teeth. You can see these here on the tweakers panel. Lips towards teeth. We're going to use these controls for this adjustment. One of the reasons we're selecting this is that the Faceware performance capture doesn't edit these controls. So these controls have all 0 keyframes. Let's take a look. I'll go to the search tracks and type in toward. And here we can see that we have tracks for mouth, lips towards teeth. We're going to ignore the simple mouth towards, and there's down, up, and left and right. But instead we're going to use lips towards teeth. Now if these don't come automatically expanded, you can use the triangles here, simply clicking them to expand these. Let's move the playback head so we can find the moment when our performer brings her lips together. Looks like that's right about here, in my case, on frame 240. So I'm going to set a mark at this point, tapping the M key, and right-clicking and changing the label for this mark to the word mad. So now we know where the lips need to come together. As we scrub through the timeline, we can see that the values are always 0. So we're free to delete and set our own keyframes for these controls without disturbing any of the data that we captured through Faceware. So let's just select a number of these keyframes on either side of our mad mark and delete those existing keyframes. Next, we'll move to the position that we marked earlier. Let's take a look at our MetaHuman. Just use our mouse to move our view so that we can see both our MetaHuman and our performer. And let's adjust the values of the lips towards teeth curves to bring these lips together. Note that I have the auto key option turned on. If in your sequence timeline this option is turned off, want to click this button here to activate it. Now, as I adjust the value of each of these controls, we can watch the MetaHuman lips as they come together and dial in the setting that we'd like. Just bring out these bottom lip here. This will be the bottom lip on the left side. Now they're touching, but let's bring the top lip down as well. Just a little bit. And there we go. Now we don't want this single keyframe to be taking over the entire clip, but we know that our zeros are already keyframed for all of the rest of our frames. So we can keep this as it is,
and the mad whale, and
or we can set our own 0 keyframe a little bit earlier. 0, tab 0, tab 0, tab 0, so that we get in and out of this lip press more efficiently. 0, tab 0, tab 0, tab 0. Enter. So there's our keyframes. Let's look at that played back.
and the mad whale, and started bending and quacking.
Great. So let's take a look at another scenario, this time where we want to edit values that have been recorded by Faceware. Clear out my filter and collapse our control board rig. And let's scrub our way to the beginning of the clip. Here, if we look at our reference and compare it to our MetaHuman, we're going to see that our performer has a bit more shape to her lips than the MetaHuman. Let's see what we can do to address this. The shape of this performer's lips here can be reproduced using funnel controls in the MetaHuman facial control rig. We can find those, of course, by going to our search tracks and typing in the word funnel. And here they are. We have right and left for the up and down set of lips. The only thing is, when we expand these, we notice that there are non-zero values. This means that Faceware is generating values for the funneling of the lips, and we wouldn't want to necessarily lose that life. So let's add a new section to the controls for the control board rig. We can do this by going to the face control rig. And rather than absolute, we want to choose additive. This way, the keys that we add to this will be in addition to the keys that we've already gotten from Faceware. So we'll choose additive. And now we have two groups of face control board rig. The block of animation additive area has been started here at frame 47 where our playback head is. So let's drag that back to the beginning. And it should automatically go to the end of our clip. Just to make sure that's the case, we'll just extend it here. That way, any keys that we add to this additive section will work. This additive section does actually contain all the control curve values for the entire control board rig. So if we deactivate our filter here, we can see that we actually have two separate sections for the face control rig. One is additive, and the other is all the data that we have from Faceware. All right, so let's go to those funnel controls and see if we can adjust the values here to get a better shape from our MetaHuman. So we'll keep an eye on our MetaHuman lips as we increase the value here. And now we start. Maybe not all the way up to 1. Try this just at 0.9. Now this is the upper right, so we'll do the same for the upper left. 0.9. That's clearly too much now that we have both sides. So let's ease that off. Let's try 0.6. Looks a little bit better. Lower lip will give a little bit. Let's try 0.4. I'm just using the tab key or shift tab to go up, tab to go down. 0.4. And our performer's lips are a little sticky on the edges. So let's add some stickiness to our lips to bring those edges a little closer together. Before I leave this, I want to go ahead and set some keyframes for this. So we'll go ahead and key each of these. And we'll also set 0 keys before and after this so that we don't have this funneling happening throughout their entire animation. Let's zoom in on our timeline. So here our lips should be together. We'll set zeros. 0, tab 0, tab 0, tab 0. I can also drag select these keyframes Click and drag, select all four, Control C, copy. I'll move my playhead to a few frames after where her mouth is open, and Control V, paste. And so now they're back to 0. So for all the frames after this, we'll have no adjustments to funnel, and all the frames before this, there's no adjustments. But in between these two sets of 0 value frames, we'll be approaching this funneling right here. All right, let's take a look at the stickiness of our lips. So right about here, 0.53 looks good. We'll set this the same way. And look at that. A much better pose for our metahuman. Again, we'll key here. Go a few frames earlier when her lips should be closed. We'll zero these out. Drag, select, copy, Control C. Go a few frames after, and Control V, paste so that we remove that stickiness to the lips. We might want to bring these 0 frames after a little bit closer. There we go. Okay, so this is another way that we can edit. As one final note, I just wanted to point out that the sequencer does have its own curve editor built into it. It's accessed by this last button on the sequencer's toolbar. In this case, let's take a look at the jaw motion that was recorded by Faceware and adjust it using the curve editor in sequencer so we can get these lips to come completely closed. So rather than sticky, I'll go ahead and search for jaw. And scroll up here and find our jaw control. There's an X and a Y value, and we can see that the Y value isn't quite 0 here, and it's leaving the lips open. Our performer's lips are closed. So let's just adjust this playback so we find where her lips start to open right there. So before this frame 45, we'd really like to keep the lips completely closed. Let's go into Curve Editor to adjust this. So I have the jaw curve selected, and I'll click here to activate the Curve Editor. Here we have the same Curve Editor interface that we had with animation sequences. Let's focus on the first several keyframes for this animation. I'll click drag to select them and tap the F key to fit them to the frame. I'll lower the top of this window so we can see our performer and our metahuman. And here we are on frame 44, and we see that at this point our performer's lips are beginning to open, so that's fine for the metahuman. But on 43, our performer's lips are closed, and yet our jaw is still open. So let's edit these keyframes. I can have my selection mode, I can have my transform mode, and let's go ahead and deactivate the snapping for the verticals. Now, a few options I have are that I could simply select these keyframes. This is the Y set of keys. If I wanted to make sure that I'm only working in Y, I could go ahead to my control curve for the jaw and click on Y. And now I'm only seeing the Y values. So again, I'll select at the beginning of the curve, tap F to fit this to the frame. I'll use 2 mouse buttons to click and drag to move. So here's my 0. I want to get all of these frames here down to 0. So I will click and drag to select these. And because my transform tool is on, I can go ahead and stretch these, scale these effectively together. And then click and drag to, oops, sorry, not on the bottom here. We want to click and drag to bring these keys down. So let's deactivate our transformation tool. Select these keys and simply click and drag them down to about 0. So now our lips are closed and then they open up smoothly. Maybe we smooth out this curve a little bit. So that's one approach. Another is I could simply delete all of these keyframes right here. using the delete key. And to correct this, I can right-click on my first key and change it from being linear to be user. And I'll do the same with my second key. So click, right-click, user. And now I can set tangents for these. Ease into this curve. And again, our ellipses are closed, and then they open in sync with our performer. So this gives us full access to all the features of the curve editor, including the frequency filtering. Right here in Sequencer, where we can see our video playback along with our MetaHuman performance. With all of these edits in place, maybe it would be a good idea to bake all of the results down to a single animation sequence that we could reuse in other sequences or even migrate to other projects. To do that, we can exit from our curve editor. In our sequencer window, we find the face track, right-click, and choose Bake Animation Sequence. Here, we'll select our MetaHuman folder, Danielle, and Animations as the destination for this new asset, and we'll give this a name. I'll call this HPD for Hungry Purple Dinosaur, underscore, edit, underscore, and maybe this is VO2 for version 2. We'll say OK, accept our defaults, and export to animation sequence. This gives us a new animation sequence that's available in our content browser. Here's that version 2. We can select that and Control S to save. So now all of the edits that we just finished in Sequencer are available as a single sequence. And we can put that to use here in Sequencer simply by muting our face control rig, right-click, and mute. And now all of these keyframes will be ignored. We can add our animation sequence back in simply by deactivating our filter to show all the tracks, bringing our playback head back to the beginning of our clip, frame 0, and finally going to the face animation track and adding an animation, in this case HPD Edit version 2. Now the animation's added in as an animation sequence, and we can hit play to play it back.
The hungry purple dinosaur ate the kind zingy fox and the mad whale and started bending and quacking.
So there you go, a number of different ways that you can edit the data that you've captured in Faceware directly in Sequencer while referencing video and audio from your original take. In this module, we're going to take a look at a bonus tool provided with the sample project that comes with this course. The tool allows for the facial animation to be separated into separate segments by facial region, giving us more control over the attenuation of the performance for different regions of the face. Before we start segmenting this performance, let's output a pre-synchronized copy. Right now we have our animation that was captured by the take recorder, and it's been positioned in our sequencer timeline so that it's in sync with our audio. Let's output this to a new animation sequence that'll be baked in the appropriate synchronization. To do this, we'll simply right-click on the face track for our MetaHuman and choose Bake Animation Sequence. Here we'll go ahead and select our Danielle folder to save this into, and then further go into Animations. Finally, we'll give this a new name. For simplicity, we'll just call this Anim Sync. Say OK, accept the defaults, and export to animation sequence. With this, we should now have a new animation sequence available in our content browser under our Danielle MetaHuman under Animations. And here it is, Anim Sync. I'll select it and use Ctrl S to save. And now that this is selected, we can run our bonus tool with it. To find our bonus tool, we'll go to Content and the Automation folder. Here you'll find MHAnim Segmenter. It's version 7 as of this recording. Right-click and choose Run Editor Utility Widget. This will open the basic user interface for this widget. Let's go back to our animation using the back button, and once again. And now we have our animation sync selected. This tool is designed to run on a selected animation sequence in the content browser. If no animation sequence is selected, this will not run properly. Each button is a different mode of running this. There is a multiplier set to 6, and we want to have that default value in general, and we'll show why in just a bit. Now, the most basic way to use this tool is to simply use the Generate Clean Curves set. Let's take a look at what's inside our Anim Sync. If we double-click, we'll find that we have 768 curves. So the bake process, like Take Recorder, recorded a lot of curves that we don't necessarily need. We'll just pause the playback, and as we scroll over our curves, we'll see that we have a number of control curves for our wrinkle maps, as well as, again, for levels of detail. Additionally, there are curves that are not for wrinkle maps and not for level of detail, but that simply have 0 as their only value throughout the duration of the entire animation. So these curves are also not necessary since the only value they output is 0. If we go ahead and close this, we can use the Generate Clean Curve set to create a copy of this animation sequence that has no curves that are unnecessary. So with Anim Sync selected, I can click the Generate Clean Curve Set button, and this will create a copy of our animation sequence. And here it is, Anim Sync _clean. If we double click this, we'll find that we have only 88 curves. These are the 88 curves that actually contain data that are not related to level of detail or wrinkle maps. And so this is the actual data that was recorded from our original take. So that's a basic clean, and that makes a really efficient animation sequence. On the opposite end of our spectrum is running the full segment innator. Yeah, okay, it's a silly name. But what this will do is not only clean the unnecessary curves from the data, but also separate the curves into separate animation sequences, one for each group of controls for the face. So let's go ahead and click our Anim Sync and run the full segment innator. Now this will also be multiplying the curve values by 6. And the reason for that is that we're generating 6 different animation sequences, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and we'll have to average these out in Sequencer when we stack them. So by multiplying the values by 6, we'll have a complete copy of the facial animation when we stack these in Sequencer, and they'll be scaled properly. So for example, if we just look at the Anim Sync brow, double click, we find we have only 8 curves. So these are all the curves related to the brow movements. And you can see that in the example here, the brows are moving and no other aspect of the face is moving. You might notice again that these movements are a little bit exaggerated, and that would be a result of these values having been multiplied by 6. So if I were to pause, for example, select a couple curves, and right-click and choose Edit Selected Curves, you'll see that rather than stopping at 1, our values go all the way up to 2.5. So let's put this to use inside our sequencer. For now, I can go ahead and move my segmenter out of the way and go into Sequencer, and we'll add those sequences to our face. So I'll take the existing sequence and just remove it from our sequence. And we'll just add all 6 of our animations. So I'll click on plus animation, and here we have sync brows at the top of the head, and it was added to frame 90. Let's slide that into frame 0, and then we'll move our playhead back to frame 0 so that all our future ads will be in the right spot. Now we can continue adding more animation sequences. So we'll click on animation again, and then we'll use the eyes, and then we'll click on animation again, And we'll choose the nose. There we are. Now, we're not seeing them because they're stacked under animation. We can turn this triangle down and see that here we have brows, eyes, nose. We'll add the mouth and then the jaw. And finally, at the neck. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different animation sequences, all stacked together, all in sync, inside Sequencer. And further, if we spin down the control to the left of these animations, we can see that their weight is set to 1. So Sequencer will add up all the values, let's say, for the jaw, for example, except that the jaw value is always 0 in the 5 non-jaw animation sequences. After adding up all the values, it'll divide by the number of animation sequences that were added up, 6. And this is why we have the multiplier of 6 in the segmenter itself. By multiplying this jaw value by 6, it gets added in, divided by 6 to return to its original values here in Sequencer. So now as we scrub through, we should see the same exact animation as we were before. Now the value of this is that we can attenuate this performance with each one of these animation tracks. So for example, if we decided that the mouth should be opening a bit more, meaning the jaw, we can expand the animation weight for the jaw, and let's go to 1.5. And you see that the jaw is now opening further. We haven't really had to adjust anything else, but now we're getting more performance, more exaggerated output from the jaw performance. Similarly, maybe we want to reduce the amount of movement in the eyes. So we can find the eyes track, expand that animation, and set its weight to 0.8. And now we've reduced the degree to which the eyes are moving left and right. And rather than having to set the values of multipliers or adjust the curves for every single control related to the eyes, we just used 0.8 and multiplied it by all the control curves for the eyes. So this allows us the ability to tune the performance of this metahuman face by face group rather than by individual curves. As before, we can still bake this resulting finished animation to our control rig for further refinement. Simply right-click on our face track, choose Bake to Control Rig, and Face Control Board Control Rig. We'll accept the defaults and hit Create, and this will bake our fully combined animation. It'll disable all of our animation tracks, so we can collapse those. And so now all that animation is available for editing here in the control board, as we did before. As a final note, this tool is set up to provide you the ability to adjust the multiplier value itself using this slider. Again, a value of 6 is ideal. And you can also generate individual control curve groups by using these buttons. Honestly, I'm not 100% sure how useful that would be, but it just seemed like the logical thing to do to provide animators with as much flexibility as possible when using the segmenting tool. I hope this helps. Until next time, have fun. Thank you for participating in this course on real-time workflows with Faceware Studio. I hope this course was helpful. In addition to learning about the fundamentals of setting up Faceware Studio and the associated streaming plugins in Unreal Engine, you've also learned to customize and tune the individual facial performance channels being streamed from Faceware Studio, how to record facial performance in Unreal Engine, and how to edit those recorded animations using tools in the Unreal Engine sequencer. Good luck with your Unreal MetaHuman facial performance projects.